It's a big week here on campus as spring break is out of the way and spring football begins tomorrow, Rodney, for the Crimson Tide. And there are questions, as is the case with every team in America, even the reigning national champions. Let's get into some questions that will have to be answered this spring. And I want to start with Daron Payne because he was such a dynamic player, to be an interior guy that could affect the game in different ways, amazingly athletic at 311 pounds. He was one of those players, you just plugged him in there and took him for granted, but now he's gone, and there doesn't seem to be a single guy on the roster that can kind of fill that role. It looks like it may be replacing Daron Payne by committee, so to speak. How do you see that playing out with someone trying to kind of win that nose tackle spot?
Well, first of all, I mean, you always build your team on what you have. It's not always the same. Obviously Alabama's had some great defensive linemen. They haven't always had a Daron Payne there that they could stick in the middle and, move around a little bit that was athletic as he is. You just don't find those kind of guys at 310 pounds. But they have some guys, obviously, with some very talented players. A lot of those guys developed last year, Isaiah Buggs. Obviously, Raekwon Davis finished very, very strong. Those are two great players. I mean, now, obviously, they're different kind of players. But you've got some younger guys that I think certainly show a lot of promise as well. One guy that, as we've talked about many times on the show here, Gary, Fadarian Mathis, a redshirt freshman, a guy that redshirted this past season. I think he's a guy at 6'3", 6'4", 308, 310 pounds, has a chance to be a really good interior player. Stephon Wynn is a true freshman. It's an early enrollee. It's listed at 6'4", 310 on the roster. Now, again, are these guys Daron Payne? No, but there's certainly guys that I think are very potentially very gifted players who are going to be outstanding players. But as far as replacing Daron Payne, you just simply can't do it. You have to build with what you have.
Across the ball, I'm sure there was some great battles between Payne and Bradley Bozeman, and Bozeman is gone as well, the starting center for the Crimson Tide. There's some talk that there may be some position shifting there, but you've got other players on the roster who are more pure centers that will be looking for an opportunity to step out. Talk about replacing Bozeman as the ball snapper.
Well, yeah, there has been some discussion of possibly looking at Jonah Williams at center. He's a guy that has versatility, much like Barrett Jones had when he was here. Guy that very intelligent. Gary understands all the front positions, has that versatility athletically to play the spot. Wouldn't be surprising if he got a look there at center. Again, just a look. It doesn't mean that that's something that would be written in stone. But other guys you mentioned, Brandon Kennedy's been around a few years. Not sure what his status is in terms of the injury that he had towards the end of the last season that would possibly prevent him from going full bore in spring practice. But again, he is a guy that certainly has gotten some reps at the center spot. Chris Owens is another guy, young redshirt sophomore who has some potential. Ross Piercebaker, if you remember a few years ago, was actually penciled in as the starter heading into the USC game about 8 to 10 days before, and that's when Nick Saban made the move and put Bradley Bozeman at that spot and moved Piercebaker back to guard. So there's a possibility you could see Ross Piercebaker get some reps this spring. And there's some other guys that have been around. Josh Casher's played center and guard in his time here, though he hasn't gotten much playing time. He certainly practiced at those positions.
The cornerbacks, Anthony Averett and Levi Wallace depart. Mika Fitzpatrick, played some at corner, could play there certainly, and so we'll get to the safeties in a moment. But let's focus on cornerbacks. Trayvon Diggs has got a lot of experience. Actually started last year going into the season as a starter at corner. Savion Smith is in already working. You've got some highly touted freshmen coming in, but that's a position that normally takes some time to learn. And Alabama has had such a good situation there, but suddenly now you're looking at inexperience at the cornerback position.
Yeah, you lost those two that you mentioned. Averett and Levi Wallace did an outstanding job last year. Trayvon Diggs had actually won that left corner job, in fall camp, and then had a couple of busted coverages in the FSU game early. He was replaced by Levi Wallace, who did a fantastic job shutting that side of the field down for the most part. And but Trevon is a very gifted player. I mean, he's very instinctive guy. That's one of his greatest assets. He has excellent size. Gary's 6'2", close to 200 pounds. I mean, that's a big corner if he stays there. But he would have to be a favorite, I think, as you start to head into spring practice to be one of those corners. Again, and as I mentioned, he's very versatile. He's athletic. He's a guy also now look, they're short on safeties as well. I think Trevon Diggs, I thought he could be an Eddie Jackson type safety coming out of high school. But I would say now, probably he's a guy that will stick at corner at this point. Savion Smith, you mentioned him. He's a guy that is a former 5-star recruit, signed with LSU out of high school, transferred to Mississippi Gulf Coast Community College, had a fantastic year last year, looked really, really good in the practices leading up to the Clemson and Georgia games because he enrolled early. So he's a guy that the coaching staff has had an opportunity to watch firsthand. And I think, Gary, the buzz is that he has all the tools to develop into a really, really outstanding cornerback. So I think Savion Smith being here, going through spring practice is going to be huge. Obviously, there's some other guys that have been around. Shy Carter's a guy, if you remember, Gary, on the third down in overtime against Georgia. He was in at that star position rather than Tony Brown. So, Shy Carter's a talented kid. He's going to be a junior. He hasn't gotten much playing time, but, he certainly has some skills as a corner, as a star, even could play safety, actually. Jared Maiden's been around a while, hasn't played much. This is a big spring for him at the corner spot. Nigel Knott's been around. Of course, he's had some injuries. Kareem McDonald's a real interesting guy. He could play probably more of a star position player. Could even play safety. I really like him. He was redshirted as a freshman last year. But as you mentioned, Gary, a lot of really talented young players coming in this summer that could shake things up a little bit.
And for safety, you've got Deontay Thompson, who got a lot of experience this past season and came in when Hootie Jones got injured. I thought he played great down the stretch for Alabama. You got a couple of young players there, Xavier McKinney and Daniel Wright, that showed a lot of potential, particularly on special teams. Kyrie McDonald is a guy who could factor in there. You've got some true freshmen coming in that could help there as well. How do you see the safety position in the spring?
Yeah, when you just look at the numbers, it doesn't look – you've got Deontay Thompson, Xavier McKinney, Daniel Wright, maybe perhaps Kareem McDonald will get some work back there. And like I said, Shy Carter is certainly versatile enough to do that as well. Kind of cross-train a little bit, which is what Nick Saban does a lot in the secondary with some of these guys who have that versatility. Work them some at safety, work them some at corner, try to find the right fit. So you could see that. Deontay Thompson, Gary, guy that was really highly recruited out of the West Orange, Beaumont, Texas area a few years ago, came in here as highly regarded player, has kind of waited his turn. And you're right. I mean, he looked outstanding in the playoff games, against Clemson and Georgia. And I think he's a guy that, as you start to look forward and say who could be a leader, who could emerge as a star player, early for this secondary, I think Deontay Thompson's one of those guys. And I think the two true freshmen from last year both played some, Xavier McKinney and Daniel Wright. I think both of those guys, athletically are very, very gifted. It's a matter of them really becoming acclimated with what they're doing. And this is a great opportunity for both of those guys.
Spring football preview. Spring practice at Alabama starts tomorrow. We're breaking it down with Rodney Orr from TiderInsider.com and TiderInsider TV. When you look at Alabama's roster at this point in the Nick Saban regime, it is just loaded with talented players. So I don't think talent is ever an issue going into a spring practice campaign. Certainly once the freshmen all come in for the fall. But as we talk about, you have to develop players. Not everybody can play. We mentioned the center position. Offensive line is an area where a lot of guys get looks in the spring because by fall practice, as you know, Rodney, they start trying to find 5 guys and really start putting that line together. This is an area where there are a lot of players that have been recruited, highly touted players. Now there are a couple of openings. Who are some young guys that maybe have been in the program now for a couple of years, Lashley and others that might could step up? I know Chris Owens has been around. Who are some of the young guys on the offensive line that might fill some voids there in addition to the center position?
Yeah, well, when you look at that offensive line, actually 4 of those guys returned from last year. Jonah Williams, left tackle, Ross Fishbaker, left guard, right guard, Lester Cotton. Don't know his status for this spring after his injury, but he's been a guy that started for the better part of 2 years. The right tackle, Matt Womack, started every game there last year. But there is a lot of competition. There are a lot of young players I think are going to challenge this spring. That's what makes it so interesting. But I think, Gary, that's one thing with people who kind of follow spring practice day to day. They need to be careful getting too caught up early on, at least with these groupings on the offensive line, because there's so many guys that I think are going to be moved around, experiments, trying to evaluate each guy at different positions, whatever it might be. But Alex Leatherwood, what about the job he did last year against Georgia when he came in the third quarter, replacing Jonah Williams? He's a guy that, Gary, it's going to be really hard to keep Alex Leatherwood off the field. And, that's what makes, I think, Jonah Williams' versatility so important, because you could find another spot for him if you wanted to put Leatherwood at left tackle. Leatherwood could work at guard. He's certainly talented enough to do that. But the other guy on the other side that was a true freshman last year is probably maybe just as talented, Jedrick Wills. So, what do you do with him? Do you work him in at right tackle and slide Womack in maybe to right guard and see how that looks this spring? Do you maybe work Jedrick Wills at center? I didn't mention him, but he certainly has the capabilities of working in at center, could play guard. So those are 2 really talented guys that were true freshmen last year that I think have a great opportunity to crack the starting lineup somehow, some way. This year, you have a lot of people that have been around for a while. We mentioned Casher, Dallas Warmack still around, Gary, and he's a guy that works at the interior spots. Richie Pettibone's another guy who's been around for a while. Deontay Brown has a lot of talent. His big problem has been just kind of keeping his weight down. If he could get his weight down, he would certainly challenge for a spot. We'll see how he does this spring. But, a number of guys that are very, very talented that have opportunities. You mentioned Scott Lashley. I mean, physically, when you draw them up, you don't really you couldn't draw one up, I don't think, any better than Scott Lashley out of West Point, Mississippi, just be a sophomore this year. So, he's a guy that could challenge at one of the tackle spots. If, Gary, the light bulb kind of goes off and he takes off, that's a guy to really keep an eye on.
Yeah, a lot of really big, talented players on that offensive line for Alabama. Of course, the quarterbacks are going to get so much scrutiny and media attention in the spring. That's just the way it's going to be. I know Nick Saban and that coaching staff will handle it the way they see fit, and I doubt very seriously, we've talked about this before, that there's going to be any announcement on a quarterback coming out of spring practice. Of course, Jalen Hurts goes into the spring as a 2-year starter. Tua Tagovailoa goes into spring as a guy who came into the second half to lead Alabama to a national championship. Mac Jones is the 3rd quarterback that's on scholarship. You got a transfer coming in after spring practice from East Carolina, so there'll be 4 quarterbacks on scholarship going into the fall. But how do you think, and again, we don't know, but just your opinion on how these reps will be split and how they'll handle these quarterbacks in spring ball?
Oh, I imagine that it'll be about even. And I think you'll see Mac Jones get a lot of reps too. I mean, I just think that they're trying to develop these guys. You've got a new offensive coordinator, Michael Oxley, though that doesn't mean everything's changing because he's been, within the system here. But, some things will change. Dan Enos, I'm sure he'll have some input as well because he's been an outstanding offensive coordinator in the past, now the quarterback's coach here. So I think that they'll work as a team together to kind of put this offense together with Mike Loxley heading it up. So I think it's a lot about just developing each one of those guys and getting a comfort level with them and so that they can execute the offense the way that they want to, execute it, and which is at a high level. And so I think that's really going to be the focus this spring, and I assume that all 3 of them will get some quality reps.
And this coaching staff is, to some degree, a new staff. I mean, there's been a lot of change up. Mike Loxley and Tosh Lapoy aren't new coaches, but they're new coordinators. Jeff Banks, special teams coordinator and tight ends coach, is new. Dan Enos, who you referenced, associate head coach and quarterbacks, is new. Josh Gaddis, co-offensive coordinator and wide receivers, is new. Pete Golding, co-defensive coordinator and inside linebackers coach, is new. Craig Kuligowski, associate head coach for the defensive line, is new. Carl Scott, coaching defensive backs, is new. Even a guy like Joe Panunzio moves from tight ends to running backs. Burton Burns is now an assistant athletics director for football off the field. So there's going to be a learning curve, not just for the players in terms of the spring and getting acclimated, but for these coaches getting acclimated to the players and back and forth. I mean, this is going to be very crucial in regards to this football team coming together as this coaching staff meshing together, right?
Oh, yeah, I think it's quite a shuffle. I mean, you're coming off a national championship. Nick Saban didn't sit still. Now, again, some of these moves were required because you have, obviously, Jeremy Pruitt became the head coach at Tennessee, and the defensive line coach Carl Dunbar went on back to the NFL, which was not unexpected. Derek Ansley decided to go to the NFL as well. So, coaches come and go, they move on. And I think there's probably, again, this is just an opinion because watching it, and you probably might feel the same way, is, there's some interest there on the defensive side because you've had that Kirby Smart factor for 9 years, and then you plugged in Jeremy Pruitt, which is, you go from Kirby Smart, a guy that knows the system, to Jeremy Pruitt, who's grew up in the system. So there's a little bit of, as you mentioned, Gary, the word is new. Tosh Lapoy has been around. He was, a year under Kirby Smart, a couple of years under Pruitt. So he's been around, but still this will be his first time to call a defense. So that's certainly something that I think is interesting. And we're not going to see that this spring, obviously, but it'll be interesting to see how they develop defensively and get some feedback from the scrimmages and so forth. But I think there's a lot of meshing that has to go on. But I will say this, all of these guys are young, for the most part, enthusiastic, energetic. They've got good track records, not only as coaches, but excellent recruiters. I really think that Kuligowski on the defensive line kind of solidified everything to me. I mean, he's a guy that is a great developer of defensive linemen. Gary, he's taken some guys that weren't the most highly recruited players and turned them into first-round draft picks. I mean, he is that kind of coach on the defensive line. He's experienced. He's 49 years old. He's coached with Gary Pinkel, who's an outstanding coach. So I think overall, I really like the staff. But as you said, it's about, kind of meshing together and developing that chemistry.
Spring football preview with Rodney Orr from TiderInsider.com and TiderInsider TV. Pretty good breakdown, as always, from Rod. Final question, recruiting update. I know it was spring break this past week. Anything Alabama's watching as far as a player that might be ready to commit in the near future, or any news on that front?
To be honest with you, Gary, it's obviously going to start picking up. I've talked to a few high school coaches over the past week, not many, but a few. Some prospects will start to trickle in for visits, and, some really big-time players I think we're going to host here during the spring practices. And I will say this, nothing really specific right now in terms of that, guys ready to commit, though you never know. It's still early, but I do think that you're going to see Alabama kind of push up its schedule a little bit this year, make their evaluations, maybe get some more commitments earlier, and really kind of get prepared to sign as many guys in December as possible this year. Last year, you remember, they signed 15. I could see them trying to push that to 20 or so in this particular class, almost try to wrap it up early.